to this last evening event. Today we're going to have a little panel discussion with our eminent speakers about applying spirituality in times of crisis. In these fractured times, what are we supposed to do? What is our role? As you see, there's so much political chaos, social chaos, climate chaos. What are we as spiritual aspirants supposed to do about this, if anything? So today, I also have on stage here, everybody knows the speakers. Also, I have Maitri. Maitri is a San Diego devotee. She's a teacher, and she is a sort of well-versed in the political and social climate. So we devised some questions together to be able to ask our eminent speakers here. So I'd like to first have Maitri sort of do an overview of what's happening in the world.
I wish I actually knew the answer to that, Swami, but I'm hoping to get some here. I first want to say I am so honored. I'm here as a student in the company of the most revered, wonderful dream team of teachers I could even imagine. So, thank you for the honor of posing these questions. And now, I'm hoping we can up the ante for you a little bit. Make it a little bit harder questions, which as a teacher I like to do. We are on retreat. We are protected. It is sweet and quiet, and there are waves, and it's not noisy, and everybody is in kind of a good vibration here. But let's face it, we all have to leave this space eventually. And we have to deal with a world that may not feel as peaceful all the time. So here's the set of questions that we have for you. Talk about this fraught world. We hear, if you're watching the news, you hear about how divided we all are, not just in the United States, but around the world. There's a lot of anger out there and a lot of fear. And we have to navigate that whether we choose to engage or not, because at some point you have to go to the grocery store and try to park without somebody getting angry with you. So I made some notes here about what I wanted to mention. I mentioned to a few people in the last couple of days here what we plan to talk about tonight. And I discovered that there is an elephant in the room that if you mention its name, people shrink back invariably, and the word is politics. I said it. Do not be afraid. We are not here about content, but what our hope is that you can instruct us on how to navigate the lowercase real world, which can get pretty noisy sometimes, using the teachings that you've been giving us here today. And as one example, that came to me this morning, Professor Berlin, you were talking about soft belly, strong back, and you were talking about facing a patient who is in great distress and perhaps great pain, perhaps fearful. And so I'm hoping within these questions you'll be able to talk to us about how do you bring that soft belly, strong back to the person who's angry with you? Whom you want to try to express something to and they're not ready to hear it. So those are the sorts of questions we have, and I'm passing the baton to Swami Harinamananda.
So the main question, the first question that's going to come up is, sometimes you feel there's a lot of injustice. Sometimes you feel there's discrimination. There's a lot of things going on. What is our role in today's current times? As spiritual aspirants, the question is, do we engage or disengage? What is our role? And maybe I can throw this question to anybody, and whoever wants to answer can answer. Maybe Swami Atmarupananda, would you like to start off?
There's a place for engagement and a place for disengagement, both, depending on our temperament
and depending on the situation. So let me explain a little bit. First of all, in any situation, whether it's a large political situation or something more personal, we have to remember that I don't gain anything, nor do I help the situation by losing my inner balance. Let me give an illustration to explain what I mean. We had an English Swami in Trabuco for many, many years, Swami Atmarupananda, who passed away many years ago, or no, a few years ago. The story I'm telling is back from the late 1970s, late 1970s. There was a brahmachari at that time in Trabuco named Roland. He was cutting the grass on a hillside in Trabuco behind the monastery, for those of you who have seen the Trabuco Monastery. And because this hill was very steep and he was cutting this way along the edge of the hill, the riding lawnmower began to roll down the hill with him on it. It rolled down the hill, him still holding onto the wheel, getting hit every time it rolled over him. Badly hurt. It ended up on down at the bottom of the long hill with him under the lawnmower, not the cutting blade, but under the cutting blade up above. He was badly hurt, broken ribs and cuts and so forth. So everyone was going wild. Oh, Rolo is hurt, Rolo is hurt. What do we do? What do we do? People running around, not knowing what to do. And they went and called Swami Atmarupananda, who had been a medic in the British Army during World War II and had seen the worst of World War II. So he came and he said, oh yes, Rolo, this wrong, that wrong, do this, do that. Very calmly, just took charge of the situation, called the medics, we need to do this. What person would you rather have at your side when you have something go wrong? Would you rather have the people that are running around saying, what do we do, what do we do, what do we do? Or a person like Swami Atmarupananda who comes and calmly says, oh, this is the situation, this is needed, that's needed, let's do this. And he takes care of the situation. The people who were terribly upset by the situation, they didn't help at all. Yet Swami Atmarupananda, because of his training, he kept his cool and he knew what to do. So my first response is, and I'll stop my answer here because there are many things that could be said. The first response is that we always have to maintain our perspective, our inner tranquility, as much as we can in trying circumstances. Sometimes it's not easy, I know. But maintain that as much as we can because we help nothing by getting terribly perturbed by the circumstances.
Chris, do you have anything to say about this? You're being in Harvard, the university where it seems to be a lot is going on over there. What do you do as a spiritual aspirant yourself? You're in the School of Divinity, and I've heard from Swami Chidakananda, there's a lot of protests going on. What's your role?
That's a great question, and not everyone agrees on what our role is as faculty, for one thing. And in my community as a Dharma teacher, I have a clear sense of my role, but other teachers, other faculty have a different view. And that can be confusing for our students. So let's see, if I start with HDS, or Harvard Divinity School, number one, you mentioned the elephant in the room, which I initially thought you meant Ganesh, but realized that was way off base. Okay. It was important for me in my classes to not have the elephant in the room as something hanging over everyone. This was especially true after October 7th. And so I brought it up in my classes, but it was important. I think to your question, do we engage or do we not engage? I think it's more a question of how are we engaging. And so for me, the important thing was to engage from the standpoint of how do you see what is happening through the lens of your training as possible leaders. It's okay to have a feeling about something, to even feel reactive towards it as students, but that's not enough. You have to push the boundary a little bit and take your practice, your path, your view beyond that in order to use it as formations, spiritual formations, a term we have at Harvard Divinity School. And so people could express, we do what's called a circle or council practice, where people can say whatever is on their hearts, whatever they're feeling. One young woman who was an Israeli who just sobbed for 3 hours in the class. She wouldn't have done that otherwise. It was important to allow space for people to share, and she was comforted by our students. This is what is not reported in the media, is just how much mutual support there still is, despite what we're hearing in the sound bites, the media, and social media, and all of that. So for me, I think my role there is to definitely not take a side, which, of course, our students are really wanting to assess, who are you and what side are you on? We need to know how we think about you. This can also be true about Dharma teachers. There was a Dharma teacher who came out and spoke on behalf of one side, just emphatically had an opinion, but he didn't say anything about how Dharma sees it. In that moment, he had the role of an activist. No problem with activism. But as a Dharma teacher, I lost some respect because there was no food or fuel there for us to digest what was happening and turn it into some kind of wisdom. And so I expressed that in my community, and there was a little pushback. You need to take a side. And I think we can't take the bait as teachers. We have to constantly, especially in these non-dual traditions, see past the quote-unquote sides. Even if we have an opinion, so what? Yeah, we have to make sense out of it. So this is what I told my community, because we've had a lot of activists in my community, very progressive people, but they wanted to know, how should we engage with what's happening? And so we did a 7-week program on how we can cultivate a middle path using non-dual principles and yet still remain engaged. And one of those is fierce compassion. In Buddhism, we have this notion of fierce compassion. In other words, compassion isn't just this soft, kind of anything goes kind of thing, but it has a force to it. It has an energy. And because of the sharp sword of wisdom that Drushu wields in Buddhism, we have to put up boundaries. We have to say, this doesn't work. And yet we're not robbing someone of their dignity in the process. We're not branding them as bad or evil or anything. But rather, we're saying, I recognize this is where you are, but it doesn't work for either of us. So we need to find a different way, and just to hold to that principle. If we're non-dual teachers, it's up to us to kind of show how that might be possible, how to guide people. The difference here is fierce compassion draws on our anger for raw energy, for clarity. And yet it doesn't mean destructiveness or hatred. That is not anything near fierce compassion. So there's an energy, and I teach this to students who are wanting to be activists skillfully. No one's telling you not to be angry or outraged, but harness the energy of that and relinquish the narrative, and then you may find some insight.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. So what should our view of the world be at this point? When all this is happening, there's this sense of, do we take the view of the unreality? This is all divine play? What is the view that you see when all this is happening?
And sort of push back against the grain, I think. First of all, let's calm down. Nothing's happening. And no, really, I mean it. I don't mean it in the absolute Advaitic sense of it's all Brahman. No. I mean it with anybody in a little modicum of historical sense would know that there have always been wars. The Bhagavad Gita was taught in the middle of a horrible civil war. We are talking about COVID and wars in Gaza and Ukraine. Well, just over 100 years ago, we came out of a much worse pandemic. More people died. 1920. 1919. We still have it. We call it the flu. It's still there 100 years later with us. More people died than people died of COVID. We talk about wars. I'll give you wars. We have the senior-most member in our Vedanta society, William Conrad. He is a disciple of Swami Atmarupananda. He's been coming to the Vedanta society since 1955. He never missed a day until he went to the assisted living facility recently. This month he is 100 years old.
Wow.
This is a person who fought in the Second World War. He was a navigator flying bombers over Japan on the Pacific Theater, getting shot down over crash landing in Siberia. Tremendous story. This is a man who saw Korean War. He saw the Vietnam War. He saw the invention of the atomic bomb and the beginning of space travel and computers and internet. So I asked him once, we were going through New York, and he said, it's changed a lot. I said, how long have you seen it? Nearly 100 years, Swami. And I've always been to New York. And that's just in one lifetime. Stephen Pinker is controversially, I agree with him. He says statistically we are living in a much better world than we lived in 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, certainly 200 years ago. Much better. There's actually less violence. Statistically, much less violence. Even in the wars, the horrible wars which are going on, even in the wars, the sheer number of casualties are staggeringly down from the Vietnam War, the Korean War. You see, the entirety of the total casualties in the Gaza War, till now, there were single days in the First World War when more people were killed. In one day, the First World War. Not just one, there were a number of them. They were talking about the horrible bombings in Gaza. There were the fire bombings in Tokyo. I'm not talking about atom bombs. I'm talking about the bombings in Dresden, in Tokyo. Single night. 2 to 3 times the number of people killed total would be wiped out in a single night.
Yeah.
So it just takes a little bit of historical sense to see this has been going on. And sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better. So, yes, that's how I see it. It doesn't mean that we will not engage. That's a different topic altogether. Engagement, I think we have to do both. Engage and disengage.
In what way?
Disengage in ourselves. Look at the teachings of Vivekananda for your own self-realization, for the welfare of the world. How they engage. It's very interesting to see in the middle of conflict how you engage. Vivekananda, Mahatma Gandhi. Vivekananda, he says, no one landed on British shores with more hatred for the English race than I did. And then when he came out of those British shores, he had greatest respect and love for the British people. Still, he did not say that they were right in being colonial powers and ruling over other races. One reason why Mahatma Gandhi was so effective, the way he engaged, he had tremendous moral clarity in his anti-colonial fight. And yet, he had no hatred for the British. That's why it's very difficult to find a person like that, who really wants your best, but is also not afraid to tell you that you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
That's the way to engage, I think. Can there be too much engagement? Oh, yes. When I was in Harvard Divinity School, less fraught times than that, a few years back, before COVID, I felt there was too much engagement. Not all of it positive, not all of it beneficial either to the students or to the institution. I felt a lot of it was okay, I will not go there. You don't want to hear it. Anyway.
Thank you for your answers, and I'd like to come from the place of a student who still gets confused and torn between capital R real and lowercase r real. So I'm still left with the question unresolved. How do I know the difference between seeing that we are indeed in better times if you look back than the past? There is progress, and yet don't I have a duty here to protect something dear to me? I admit I'm very attached to democracy. I'm attached to country. And I can't look at people suffering and not say, oh my, But then here's the question. Swami Atmarupananda, we read some of your talks on engagement to prepare for this, and you mentioned that we could tip either way. You can get so caught up as to be fanatical, and we can be so complacent as to be one of those people who sat and did nothing while the Holocaust happened. But it's very hard for a student, especially somebody who's not a monastic and doesn't practice as much as all of you, to engage and yet not get caught up. And that's what I'm looking for in the sadhanas. So I'm wondering if anybody has any follow-up to how does a student engage without getting caught up, without causing more harm to myself, to others, but also not sitting by when I have a duty to perform.
Divyanandaprana,
I would say that you know very well wars begin in the minds of men. It all starts there. Hate begins there, fear begins there, anxiety lies there. If we can develop tools for mind management through these spiritual traditions, that will help us counter all these kinds of problems. Because you see, finally it all boils down to what extent can I handle my inner world, my anger, my resentment, the sheer discrimination that there is in the world at various levels. How can I handle it? And you know, spirituality contributes in a huge way to building this spiritual intelligence. And with that, you can actually work on your EQ and your, of course, IQ, EQ, there's something called VQ also, volitional quotient, and AQ, which is adversity quotient. In times of adversity, how do I address the situation? And how deeply harmonious am I within myself so that I radiate something positive even in a very negative situation? So spirituality helps us develop this kind of a mindset where we can contribute positively no matter what the external situations are. This is a possibility. See, in a group of 10 raging people, if there's at least one balanced person, he or she can give the solution to that problem. So spirituality, I would say, this is where it contributes to mind management and hence self-management. And when there is mind management, automatically there will be time management. There will be better management of the people around you and better control over people around you, on their emotions, you know, because wars and all this begin when emotions, there's an outburst and it goes out of hand totally. And so all this spirituality tempers in a big way. So if we have a spiritual consciousness, if we have worked towards it, I think all these will give things the place they deserve. And we would respectfully try to solve each problem that comes before us. I think that way it will.
I'm curious. For some part of the time, you live up in the Himalayas. So sometimes as you get more and more immersed in spirituality, then do you just start to feel the bliss of the divine, and in that sense, you become less engaged with the world, and so what happens out there doesn't really matter? Or do you become more sensitive? Do you start to expand your sense of consciousness? And as Vivekananda would feel people in the earthquakes, the pain and suffering, what happens? Do we become more immersed in the divine bliss? And sort of like Swami Atmarupananda used to tell me. He goes, what got me into consciousness was first trying to find the meaning of life. And when I tried discovering the meaning of life, the more and more I got into consciousness, the less and less I started getting away from life. So what's your feeling about this?
See, deep spiritual life does not take you away from life. Because life is the manifestation of consciousness through this body-mind complex. If you are deeply spiritual, deeply conscious within yourself, you sort of enhance your life energies and you radiate a very positive outlook. That will definitely be there. And you become more sensitive to the life in others. You become more compassionate, and naturally you are not practicing compassion there. The mind becomes like that. See, how can you love God and not love the God shining in all beings? So we become very sensitive at various levels, and I have seen this, all truly spiritual souls have a really melting heart. They can't bear the pains of others. Something like Holy Mother Sri Sarada maybe demonstrated, something like that. And so the outreach activities only increase with spiritual practice, they don't decrease. And I have seen this even in the lives of all elderly Matajis with whom I live. They become so motherly after some time. Spirituality brings about that inner change where you actually get empathy for everything. You get into the shoes of the other person and feel what that person is feeling. And so you have become now so sensitive. You know, sensitivity is the gate to sensibility. Now you have become so sensitive, you will do the sensible thing. Otherwise we won't do it. So spirituality is, I would say, the core value of human life. If that is there, you can do a whole lot of things.
So it sounds like then you're saying the more spiritual you become, the more sensitive you become. Then then it sounds like the more you want to engage.
Engagement.
Huh?
It is engagement in a different level.
Yes.
Okay.
Engagement does not mean that we conduct one group meeting and procession and fighting. That's not engagement. But engagement has a different meaning for a person. Suppose 100 boys in a university is very sincerely involved into it. But they have no rudder, they have no direction. They themselves are restless, they do not know. Character building is the first thing what Swami Vivekananda said. If that character building is done, all the good qualities will come. They will be able to decide what is good. We need not have to dictate them, hey, go out for a procession, fight there and go with gun in hand. And that's a wrong idea. But I think that it's subjective transformation, and spirituality gives them the deepest connection with the whole humanity. And as one becomes very spiritual, he will feel the suffering of it. It is more important than they pray to God. Their one prayer can have tremendous impact on them, on people's life. That's a subjective transformation. We should train our protesters who are talking to look at themselves first, to improve here. That's why Swamiji was man-making, character building is my mission.
Yes.
My mission is to give this, not to the regular solutions of the political situation or what situation. Yes, these are very important things, and young people should engage into it to change, bring a transformation. But most importantly, if anything has to be said, bring character in their own life who are trying to correct others, who are going to protest something. If they are not prepared, they are getting to the wrong direction. I think that one thing I would say, that is in every university area, and there are so many people who are thinking seriously about it, but no one talks of bringing their character, to build their own character. No one goes to any university, you see. So many protesters, so many freedom, and these freedom is not license. If freedom is not created here, this own control here, it is license. You take anything and you say, and justify that it is spirituality, it is for the love of humanity. You have no love at all, unless you love here.
I'm engaging out of anger, I'm engaging from the wrong reason. And I'm not going to help the situation. I'm going to hurt the situation. And let me come back to what Swami had asked Divyanandaprana about, and what she had answered very beautifully. Give my own experience when I was at Mayavati. At that time, Swami Prabhudanandaji, the Swami at that time in San Francisco, subscribed to Time magazine for the editor of Prabhupada Bharata at Mayavati in the Himalayas. At that time, Mayavati was very isolated. Now you can go in a bus right up to the Advaita Ashram campus. At that time, you had to walk for miles to get there, uphill. It was extremely isolated, and it's completely different now. At that time, the Time magazine was coming every week to Mayavati for the editor, and I was the editor's assistant. So he would look at it briefly and give it to me. And because I was from the West and had no other contact with the West except for Time magazine, I would look at it, and every week there would be a disaster. The world is coming to an end. I'm up there in the Himalayas, far away from everything, with no other news, no other source of news, no radio, no internet, no anything. And Time magazine comes and the world is falling apart. And the next week, Time magazine would come, and I'm wondering, what has happened? Is the world still there? Is there still and let me tell you how isolated it was. While I was there, the president of Advaita Ashrama went about 50 kilometers away from the ashram, and it took us 1 week to find out he had died. 1 week after he had died, we found out. It was that isolated. Swami Atmarupananda. And so the next week, Time magazine would come, and I would say, what has happened? Is America still existing, or has everything disappeared? And I would read it. There was no mention of the last week's disaster. Now there was a new disaster. And I would get worked up over that. And then I would think all week, what has happened? What has happened? That was a tragic situation. The next week, there was no mention of the last disaster, but a new disaster. So then I realized I have this extraordinary opportunity to be here in Mayavati, separated from all of that noise. Let me use that and not fill my mind with the latest disaster of the world, because I cannot do anything for it. I can't fix the world. So one of the things that Swami Vivekananda says over and over again is to learn that I cannot fix the world. The world is the world. As Swami said, the situation now objectively is far better than it has been. But why do we think that it's not? Because the media continually presents us with all of the news from all over the world. Suddenly the problems in Ukraine are my problems, the problems in Gaza are my problems, the problems in India are my problems, the problems in Korea are my problems. And yet I have no means to fix them. Yes, if I have a vote, if I'm in a democratic society, I need to be informed, but being informed in order to vote is not a full-time job. That's not a full-time job. And it doesn't help to be continually excited by the news. But that's the way media sells news, is by getting us excited, as I saw in Time magazine. And so one of the things we need to do, as Swami Sarvapriyananda said, and Swami Sarvadevananda in a different way, is to pull back and to realize that this is the world. This is the world that we're living in. None of us are responsible for fixing the world. The greatest tyrants in human history have been those who thought they had the solution for everyone, and who went out to impose that solution on everyone. And so Swami Vivekananda, and I'll stop with this, there's much more that could be said, but as Swami Vivekananda said, as far as your relationship to the world, love and serve. That's all we need to do. Love and serve. If we lose love, then we've engaged in the wrong way. And if we're not serving, we're engaging in the wrong way. Love and serve. We have to practice to do it, but that's what we need to do.
I'd like to say one point, that we have a national Hindu-Christian dialogue. So it is a national, means East Coast, West Coast, so churches, so many Hindu organizations together. Some Sarvapriyananda knows them, told me. So they started discussing. It's Hindu Christian dialogue. Then came this, we should be active, we should say something, and that created such a trouble. Those used to come from Hindu side, they all dropped. I don't go to hear all this fight, and this is not the question. What we can do? We can send good wish, we can say something, we can protest in a nice way to say that we don't like this war or something like that, say something. And then you go for dialogue to understand what is the foundation of Hinduism, what is the foundation of Christianity, what is the spirituality, why we meet together, and differences are there. Okay, let us accept the differences and in this. So have some harmony. And now after that, few of the very vital people we lost. And now we are thinking about now we have to change. We are focusing on spirituality. We are focusing on character building. We are focusing on how purity of life can be brought. Those are new term of dialogue has been changing from one period to another. So I think for the students, no one teaches them. Say USC, it is totally closed and classes are off and this and that. Nothing constructive going on. Because there's something is happening there, here it is stopped. Whose benefit? Who is losing their classes and their all these semesters and this and that? And yeah, there is a positive way. Young people should protest. Now we are monks, we cannot participate into everything. But the country's young people, they should join. But they should be directed in a proper way of thinking properly. Anyhow, thank you.
It's on.
Swami Atmarupananda, you mentioned, I think, just to highlight a point you mentioned, which I very much agree with, is for people who are seeking change in the world, activists, to encourage them to discern their motivation behind what they're doing. I was walking around the encampments in Harvard Yard maybe 6 weeks ago or something. It was actually pretty quiet. Everyone was at MIT. That's where everything was happening. And I had the thought of the story from the sutras, where the Buddha is sitting in his tent. And of course, that was the correlation in my mind. I was around all these tents. And I thought about this text where the Buddha is sitting in there, and Mara, the foil against all wholesomeness, who's always challenging the Buddha, trying to get him to question his enlightenment and such, appears, and Ananda, the Buddha's faithful attendant and cousin, is there, and says, Mara, what are you doing here? What do you want? Go away. The Buddha doesn't want to see you. And Mara says, well, if you just tell him I'm here, he might want to see me. Let's find out. Let's ask him. No, go away. You're just disturbing the Buddha in his peacefulness. And the Buddha's inside the tent, and he hears all this going on, and he says, is that Mara out there? Please, tell him to come in. I'm just making tea. So Ananda's frustrated. He's always frustrated when he's still when he doesn't quite understand what the Buddha is doing. And Mara enters and sits down, and the Buddha says, Mara, my old friend, how are you? Let's talk about old times. And so the point is, this spirit, I thought of this as I was walking around the encampment, that these things too are happening. You know, again, this whole notion of Time magazine saying everything is horrible, and we hear about, of course, we hear about Israelis who are being blocked from going to their campus, and then that one bite is ubiquitously present everywhere. And yet, I know students who are gathering together in these dens and having really meaningful conversations. But we don't hear this. Yeah? So, the other thing I think from a Buddhist standpoint is the notion of interdependence that we still don't quite understand as humanity. Because separation, as we all maybe have gleaned by now, is sort of the root of suffering, and unity, oneness, is really the road to liberation, whether it's in our own practice or it's communally speaking. When you drop a bomb in one part of the world, the illusion is that it will not have a ripple effect at the other part of the world. It's like dropping the pebble into the pond. That ripple will affect every part of it. And so part of that, the ignorance that Buddhism talks about, the ignorance of separation, the delusion that we are separate, that when violence erupts, to think, well, it doesn't affect me. But the truth is, on a very, very deeply subtle level, we're all impacted by what happens elsewhere. And so until we learn that lesson, and I think that speaks to the need for spirituality that others have said here, to bring that into our schools, for our children. There are more and more mindfulness programs happening in elementary school, even preschool. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's not the solution, but it at least, I think, helps with that self-regulation, hopefully, to facilitate more wisdom among our children. So
Swami Sarvapriyananda, that's what happened.
Not interdependent. Yes. All right, let me be contrary.
The one thing I like about this march is that everybody's views can be respected. At other places I find, once we start talking about these things, it gets very heated up. So even amongst our monks, I find there could be different points of view, but there's a great deal of respect amongst the views there. So please march.
So in the temple in Santa Barbara, I was invited to the convent for dinner by the Matajis. And they said, we have a rule at the table. The rule is, you don't discuss politics and religion. That's in the convent, yes. Don't discuss politics and religion. And there's sense to it. As the great saint Christopher Hitchens said, he said good people will do good things and bad people will do bad things. But to make good people do really bad things, you need religion. And at least one of the wars which is going on right now is fueled by, given clarity and purpose by religion. What do you do when I have, out of a sense of religious, maybe even spirituality, that I am right, and it gives me courage and to go out and murder my neighbor? That person is absolutely clear about it. I remember attending this online peace conference. There was like a joke, but there was actually a rabbi and a monk and a Christian pastor. They didn't all go to a bar, but anyway, they all gathered online, and we had a wonderful discussion. And the rabbi was saying, he was in Jerusalem, he was saying that from Jerusalem, where was he? He said, from here I can hear the bombs falling on Gaza. I can hear the tremors. But, here's the interesting thing. He ended the whole thing with a prayer. And the prayer went something like this. It's a very well-known Jewish prayer. O Lord, we pray for the day when all the nations of the world shall bow down, bend their knees before Thee, when all the worship of all false idols will stop. All will be worshippers of false idols will be destroyed, and idols themselves will be destroyed. And halfway through the prayer, he realized what it sounded like. And then he had to stop and explain, this is not what it means. So what do you do then? What do you do then? When religion is the source of the problem. As it is, a lot of violence throughout history, and we thought we might have put it behind us in the 20th century. Only in the 20th century there's a monopoly of violence by non-religious people. It's the Hitlers and Stalins who were committed atheists who did much more violence. It's not, alright, so religions are not going to be violent. But we had religious violence all the time. They were in India, partition riots, and now in the 21st century, at least one conflict fueled by religion. What do you do there?
give an example of a good engagement. And that was, and it's not the only one, but I use it as an example, and that was the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, when it was largely young people, black and white, who struggled for civil rights. But you see what, it was inspired by great idealism, and it was inspired by, or there was a training of the people who engaged in the fight for civil rights. So there was a clear injustice. It didn't take much depth of thought to see that the world of segregation, which I grew up in. I come from the Deep South, born in Atlanta, grew up in a small town in South Carolina, and I grew up in the days of segregation. It was when I was a teenager that the desegregation process was going on and the protests were going on. It was a clear moral wrong, what was going on in America at that time. And people were inspired by idealism, and they were also trained in how to protest. They were trained in Gandhian nonviolence. And many people sacrificed themselves. People were beaten, people were killed, but they were really ready to give their lives for something that was a clear moral principle. And so there are times when we may be called to engage in something for a clear moral right, a clear moral cause, and where we engage in the right way. So one thing is we should not be forced into engagement, like Chris was talking about. Well, you've got to choose sides. You have to choose sides. Why does he have to choose sides? Why does he have to choose sides? You don't have to choose sides. You don't have to engage. But if you see that there's an injustice right in front of you, and there's a chance for you to engage, and there's a chance for you to engage with the right state of mind, then that can be a very good thing. So there was the civil rights movement, which was a very clear moral choice. Let me take another example, and I'm hesitant to say it because this was in China, and I don't mean that the Americans were virtuous and the Chinese were unvirtuous. No, it's just that these are where these two examples took place. It had nothing to do with America or China. In China, there was the Cultural Revolution, where there was tremendous destruction, tremendous destruction. So many people were killed. There also, the idealism of youth was what was appealed to. In the civil rights movement, it was the idealism of youth that was appealed to, but it was for a just cause. And there was training of how to do it non-violently, how to sacrifice yourself for the good of others. In China, the youth were similarly inspired by Mao, and thousands of monasteries were razed to the ground. Vast libraries of texts that only existed in those libraries. Sanskrit texts from India, Hindu texts from India, Ayurvedic texts, so many different texts that only existed in Tibetan monasteries. They were all destroyed. Countless people were killed. Professors were, great professors, great artists, were put in re-education camps where they were practically slaves. So engagement is not a virtue in itself. We don't have to engage. But there are places where engagement can be very good and can be very useful if we're called upon to do it. So I don't want to give the impression from my side that engagement is bad. No, engagement can be good. If there's something in front of me where I can engage, and I can engage with the right state of mind, then well and good. But I don't have to engage, and I have to be sure of what I'm engaging in, not just join the excitement of the crowd.
Can you just clarify a little bit? What do you mean by moral issue versus political issue? What's the distinction?
I don't think I made it,
but I'm asking.
But you're asking that, okay. Moral issue, the civil rights was a moral issue because people were denied rights just because of the color of their skin. The Jim Crow era was a way of trying to preserve the benefits of slavery when slavery was outlawed. When slavery had been prevented by the Civil War and by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, It was no longer possible, or at least legal, to own a slave, but Jim Crow grew up to make sure that the old order remained in the South. And so there was a clear moral issue there. In China, the issue was a cultural issue, but the idea was that we have to destroy the old so that the communist ideal can be established. But it was done in a fanatical way and in a way that was extremely destructive. China is still suffering from that, still suffering from that.
Thank you, Swamiji. I think we talked about, can you talk about some of the issues that are close to your heart? There's some social issues maybe you mentioned, or what were the issues that you felt that in the morning when you're talking a little bit about climate, maybe what are some of the issues that you've felt strong, a little bit, not so strongly, but have felt some sensitivity towards?
Yeah, I feel intensely about global warming and the climate change which the planet is experiencing. In fact, it's so appalling when you live high up in the mountains. You can see it clearly. This year there was no snow in Balboa, and so the temperatures hit 50 degrees in Delhi. And we know the causes for it. We have released greenhouse gases to such an extent, and 52% change of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. 52% more than what was in the pre-industrial age, and all due to our carbon footprint and the way we have exploited nature at various levels and jeopardized the biogeochemical cycles of nature. So I think one wonderful solution which spiritual traditions would give to this thing happening on the planet is, there is a concept called yajna. I think most of you are familiar with it. It comes right from the Vedas. It comes from the dhatu yaj, which means to sacrifice. So the initial idea of yajna was, in the Vedic age, that it is an oblation you are pouring into the fire. It's a kind of ritual like that. But do you know what it symbolizes? That you are contributing to universal life, and you are contributing to a healthy exchange between the micro and the macrocosm. You're putting back into life what you took from it. It's a very meaningful concept. So the whole point is to live gently on the planet, to live maturely, and to live very sensibly, so that we don't, mess up with these biogeochemical cycles. That's the only way we can address climate change, in fact. And sustainable living is about this today. What the word we are using, sustainable living is actually about achieving human development goals without disrupting the cycles of nature. So we can only do this if we walk very sensibly on this planet. I told you to be sensitive to the cycles of nature and to understand I will put back what I take from it. And I will not hamper nature in any way. I will not jeopardize these cycles in any way. If we can do that, and it's also, charity begins at home. In our personal lives, if we can do this, it will sensitize us to the environment. And otherwise, it's a very terrible situation we are facing. And when you stay close to nature, you understand it clearly that nature is not happy with us.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's why we need to change this. In the third world countries, more sensitivity towards this needs to come. Yes.
The youth should be trained in this direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Must force young people to plant trees and restore the lakes and water bodies which have been destroyed. All this has to be done. And in Delhi, it requires to be done on a war footing, I would say. Because the pollution levels in Delhi are appalling. It's indescribable. All due to global warming, considerably due to that. And of course, many other factors. But for 5 months a year, if you are living at about 300 AQI, and 25 million people are doing that, it is no joke.
a sheep meadow and talking to this gentleman, Indian engineer, a Wall Street player in a company there, who's also interested in social concerns, especially in India. So we're sitting there in the shadow of what's called Billionaires Road, all the towering buildings, and sitting there talking. And he said he had gone to Orissa, the state from which the dance form which we just saw, and he had gone to, it has extensive tribal belts, and they are covered in mountains and forests, and they are being heavily mined right now. So he had gone to a place where this tribal person who lived in the forest who had never seen a city, let alone an airplane or a railway train, and their little village in the forest. And the forests are being cut, even the mountains are being destroyed because the hills actually, for extracting minerals. And so this old man who's lived all his life in the forest and who still hunts actually with bow and arrow, he asks this gentleman who told me the story, he asks him, why is this happening? Why is this happening? It hasn't happened in history for thousands of years. They have no memory of this. It's all this wholesale destruction and dispossession. And he said, this gentleman told me, he said, what could I say? My heart was breaking. I told him, it's because of what I do. In this faraway place called New York on Wall Street, it's the companies which we finance. And they are feeding our hunger. And that's why we are, across the world, we are stripping away forests and land. And yes, the local economies also benefit and so on and so forth. And then the response of that old tribal man was so, heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. He looked surprised. He said, but why? We have everything here. Why do you want to go so far away? You come and stay with me. And the man said, I just stared at him. And I just, in my mind's eye, was Wall Street and Billionaires Row. And here is this deep forest, and this person who doesn't have an education, who doesn't have any of the amenities of what we call civilized life. It's a hard existence, and that's been his life, all his life, for millennia now, through their ancestral history. And he's absolutely content. And he's happy in the midst of all this turmoil. And he says, come, we have everything here. Why go so far away?
A quick note on that. There's a company in India called Vedanta Mining. And I've been asked if we're responsible for that. No, we're not.
Well, I think at this point it's getting late, so I really want to thank our speakers, my three, and our eminent monastics, and Professor Berlin for giving us a lot of food for thought. The point of this engagement is, for us, what is our role as of right now? What's our desire? What's our need to do? What's our involvement? And I see Swami just talked about we can be in the Himalayas, we can send prayers out. There's so many ways of serving, even if you call it disengagement. As Swami Atmarupananda, even if you're not if you're not from a distance, you're still serving. So I want to thank everybody so much for your kind feedback. I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow morning. All right? See you then. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Rama Krishna Paramastu. Thank you, everyone.
বলছে ব্যাগগুলো সেকেন্ড রো থেকে রেখে দিই রাতে রাত